In the frozen expanse of Alaska, where the silence of the night is broken only by the whispering wind, a love story was meant to begin. A wedding, a celebration of devotion, of promises spoken beneath a sky laced with stars. But fate had other plans. The honeymoon phase never came. Just one night after their vows were exchanged, they were found lifeless. Two souls extinguished in the span of a single evening. The joy of matrimony shattered. A day of love swallowed by an unspeakable horror. Who would commit such an act? And why? A crime of passion or a meticulously orchestrated execution? The answers, buried beneath layers of deception, wait to be unearthed. A tale of betrayal, ambition, and an affair that would shake the very foundations of justice. Stay with us as we peel back the layers of this chilling mystery, a case where truth and lies intertwine, and where justice itself stands on trial. In the vast, frost-bitten landscapes of Alaska, where the night lingers long and the cold settles deep into the bones of the earth, a love story unfolded. One that should have endured, untouched by tragedy. Instead, it ended before it had the chance to truly begin. Judge Kindred was no ordinary man. A figure of authority, his name carried weight in the quiet corridors of justice. His presence, steady and composed, commanded the respect of those who knew the law's unforgiving nature. He was known not just for his rulings, but for the precision of his judgments. Deliberate, firm, and without sentiment. His decisions shaped lives, and within the walls of the courtroom, his word was final. Miss Vandergaw had risen through the ranks with unrelenting ambition. Young, driven, she was a force among federal prosecutors, a woman with an innate understanding of the system, of the delicate interplay between evidence and argument. She had a mind sharpened by relentless discipline, an ability to dismantle the weak foundations of a case with methodical precision. The two had worked together for years, bound by the rigid structures of the legal world. In public, their relationship was defined by formality, an expected detachment between judge and prosecutor. Yet outside the watchful gaze of the courtroom, their connection was something else entirely. It was not immediate, nor was it obvious. There were no outward signs, no sudden shifts in demeanor. It was in the small details, the extra seconds of eye contact after a ruling, the barely perceptible hesitation before an exchange of words. A careful dance, invisible to those who were not looking. And then it was no longer hidden. They were seen together. A passing glance turned into whispered rumors. A meeting outside official hours, a moment of hesitation before parting ways, a hand resting on an arm for just a fraction too long. The murmurs grew, spreading beyond the confines of the courthouse. Despite the whispers, life continued, and their union was no longer a secret to those who paid attention. A wedding was planned, quiet but elegant. It was not a grand spectacle. Judge Kindred had always preferred restraint, and Miss Vandergaw understood the weight of appearances. The ceremony was intimate, attended by those who knew them best. A gathering of colleagues, of friends, of those who had walked the path of justice alongside them. It was a cold afternoon when they stood together, exchanging vows beneath the pale Alaskan sky. The air was still, the kind of silence that comes when the snow absorbs the sound of the world. Their words carried softly, spoken with quiet certainty. The moment was theirs, a fleeting pause in the rush of their careers, a promise made beneath the gaze of those who bore witness. As night descended, the celebration began. In a small hall warmed by the glow of soft lights, they gathered, laughing, raising glasses, speaking of the years ahead. There was no sign of what was to come, no warning in the air. Just the sounds of joy, of futures unfolding in the flickering candlelight. And then the night ended. The guests departed, their laughter fading into the cold. Judge Kindred and Miss Vandergaw retired to their hotel suite, an elegant room overlooking the vast expanse of snow-covered land. The wind pressed against the windows, carrying with it the weight of the night. The door closed. By morning, the silence was absolute. When the hotel staff entered, they found them lying side by side, unmoving. The room was untouched, undisturbed. A single lamp still flickered, casting a weak glow over the remnants of the evening. The untouched remains of a wedding celebration lingered, a half-empty bottle of wine, 2 glasses resting on the table, a suit jacket draped over a chair. The air held no answers. Their bodies bore no immediate signs of violence, no wounds, no marks of struggle, and yet they were gone. Authorities arrived swiftly, The scene was examined, every inch scrutinized. The initial findings were perplexing. No forced entry, no sign of an intruder. The door had remained locked from the inside. The only people in that room were Judge Kindred and Miss Vandergaw. Toxicology reports were ordered, blood samples taken, every piece of evidence meticulously cataloged. But there was something unusual, traces of a substance, one that should not have been there. A chemical compound, one rarely encountered outside specific circles. A substance designed not to act immediately, but to take its time. The timeline became crucial. When had they ingested it? Was it in their drinks, their food? The wine glasses were tested. One contained higher concentrations than the other, a discrepancy. One had consumed more. Had it been voluntary, an accident, or was there something more? Then the final piece of evidence, Judge Kindred's phone, still resting on the bedside table. A single unread message, time-stamped in the early hours of the morning. No sender information, no identifying number. The investigation shifted. The theory of a tragic accident gave way to something else, something deliberate. But if this was no accident, who had done it? And how had they entered a room locked from the inside? Their past was examined, their professional lives unraveled, cases revisited, rulings scrutinized. Had justice come for the judge and the prosecutor? Or had this been personal? Colleagues were questioned. Were there enemies lurking in the shadows, those who had suffered under their judgments? Had a case gone too far, a ruling tipped the scales in the wrong direction? And then the most uncomfortable question of all. Was the enemy not outside, but within? Had one of them known what was to come? The wedding day had been a celebration of love. But as the hours passed, the investigation painted a different picture. One where love, power, and ambition met in a quiet hotel room, where two figures lay side by side in the dim morning light, their secrets locked away within the silence. The case was no longer just about what had happened. It was about what had been hidden all along. The final moments of celebration had passed. The last of the guests had stepped out into the cold Alaskan night, their laughter dissolving into the hush of the landscape. Footsteps faded, distant car engines hummed, and one by one, the lights inside the reception hall flickered off. The wedding was over. Judge Kindred and Miss Vandergaw departed hand in hand, moving through the quiet corridors of the hotel where they would spend their first night as husband and wife. The air was still, thick with the weight of exhaustion, of emotion stretched across an entire day of festivity. The scent of champagne lingered faintly, mingling with the crisp air that seeped through the windows. They stepped inside their suite. The door latched shut. No one would see them alive again. Hours passed. The hotel settled into silence. The halls once filled with voices and movement were now empty. Behind closed doors, guests rested, unaware that in one room, time was already slipping away. At precisely 2:13 a.m., a motion sensor at the end of the hallway recorded a brief flicker of movement. A shadow passed across the dimly lit corridor. It was too faint, too indistinct to identify. A second later, it was gone. Inside the suite, the bed was untouched. The covers remained undisturbed, folded neatly as they had been when the staff prepared the room earlier that evening. On the table, two wine glasses stood side by side. One still held the remnants of red wine, a deep crimson hue catching the dim glow of the bedside lamp. The other was empty. A single smudge of lipstick marked its rim. The air in the room remained undisturbed, yet something had changed. The silence was no longer just the absence of sound. It was something deeper. It was absolute. By morning, the hotel's housekeeping staff approached the suite. Their routine was simple: a gentle knock, a pause, an announcement of their arrival. There was no response. They tried again. The door remained locked. A key card slid into the panel, a quiet beep signifying access. As the door eased open, the first thing that met them was the soft glow of the bedside lamp, still on. The second, the lingering scent of something faintly metallic, just beneath the surface of the room's usual freshness. And then, stillness. Judge Kindred and Miss Vandergaw lay side by side. Their expressions bore no trace of fear, no sign of struggle. Their hands, resting inches apart, had not reached for each other in those final moments. Their breathing had ceased, their bodies still warmed slightly by the residual heat of the room. There were no marks, no wounds, nothing to suggest the nature of their deaths. The scene was immaculate. No overturned furniture, no sign of an altercation, no shattered glass, no traces of forced entry. The only disruption was the untouched meal service tray left near the door, the plates still neatly stacked, the silverware unused. A single phone rested on the nightstand. The screen, when lifted, displayed a notification, an unread message. The authorities were summoned. What had once been a wedding suite was now a crime scene. Investigators arrived, methodical in their approach. They moved through the room, measuring, documenting, noting every detail, however minor. Their initial findings revealed no immediate cause of death. The absence of struggle, the pristine condition of the room, the lack of external injuries, it all led to a troubling question. Had they been poisoned? The wine glasses were removed for testing. Blood samples were taken. Every surface was dusted for fingerprints. As forensic specialists worked, hotel security combed through surveillance footage. The cameras outside the suite had remained undisturbed, their lenses capturing only the occasional passing guest returning to their rooms. And yet, at 2:13 a.m., a shift, a brief flicker, a shadow moving just beyond the edge of the hallway. Who had been there? The corridor security logs showed no unauthorized access. No staff had entered the suite. No key cards had been used other than those belonging to Judge Kindred and Miss Vandergaw. The locked door became the first great puzzle. The suite was sealed from the inside. There was no possible exit beyond the main entryway. If this had been a murder, how had the perpetrator left? As investigators examined the bodies, they noted an unusual detail. The skin beneath Miss Vandergaw's nails held faint traces of something foreign, barely perceptible, but present. The lab results confirmed the presence of a chemical compound, a substance rarely found outside specialized fields. A closer examination of Judge Kindred's hands revealed something just as peculiar. No defensive wounds, no scratches, no signs of resistance. And yet there was a faint impression on his wrist, barely visible under natural light. The initial autopsy provided only partial answers. The chemical found in their blood was a paralytic agent, one designed to render its victim motionless, to slow the body's functions to the point of cessation. But it was not instant. It would have taken time. Had they ingested it unknowingly? Had one of them knowingly consumed it? And then a realization. One glass contained a much higher concentration than the other. One had consumed more. If this was an accident, how had it happened? If it was deliberate, who had made the decision? A new question arose. Was the intended victim meant to be just one of them? The message on the phone suggested knowledge. Someone had been watching. Someone knew what had taken place within that room. Yet the method was meticulous. There were no fingerprints where they should have been, no traces of forced ingestion, no sign of a struggle for survival. It was as if death had arrived quietly, without resistance, without warning. The evidence was incomplete, the timeline uncertain, and so the questions remained. Was this an external act, a murder carried out with precision, designed to leave no trace? Or was it an agreement made in the silence of that suite, a decision shared between two people whose secrets ran deeper than anyone had ever known? The answers, for now, lay in the silence of that room, in the still air that lingered long after the bodies were taken away. And outside, beneath the endless Alaskan sky, the world continued, unaware of the mystery that now lived within the walls of that hotel. Morning light seeped through the frost-covered windows of the hotel suite, casting long, pale shadows across the crime scene. The warmth of the room had faded, replaced by an unnatural stillness. Judge Kindred and Miss Vandergaw remained side by side, untouched by the chaos now unfolding outside their door. Authorities arrived swiftly, their footsteps echoing through the corridor, breaking the eerie silence. Detectives and forensic specialists moved with precision, careful not to disturb the delicate balance of evidence. Nothing in the room had been overturned. Nothing had been disturbed. Yet, 2 lives had come to a sudden and inexplicable halt. The first puzzle lay in the very nature of their deaths. Their bodies bore no signs of external trauma, no bruises, no cuts, no indication of a struggle. The door had remained locked from the inside. There was no shattered glass, no forced entry. The scene was pristine, undisturbed, as if time had simply stopped. Toxicology tests were ordered. The wine glasses on the table, still standing where they had been left, were removed for analysis. A single plate of untouched food was carefully bagged, each item recorded with meticulous attention. And then, something unusual. Judge Kindred's phone remained on the bedside table. The screen, when lifted, revealed a single unread message. Two words, stark against the glow of the screen. A message received in the early hours of the morning, but with no name, no identifying number. The phone's records were examined, but the sender had left no trace. Whoever had sent it knew how to remain invisible. The results of the initial autopsy arrived. Both victims had been exposed to a paralytic agent. The substance, rare and difficult to obtain, had been administered in a controlled dosage. It did not act immediately. It took time. The effects would have begun subtly: slowed movement, a heavy drowsiness, a gradual descent into unconsciousness. Forensic specialists turned their attention to the wine glasses. The chemical was found in both. But there was an inconsistency. One glass contained nearly 3 times the concentration of the other. Had one consumed more than the other, or had one been meant to die while the other remained? Investigators considered the possibilities. Could this have been a double murder? A carefully calculated act designed to leave no evidence? Or was it something more complex? Had one been poisoned first, the other unknowingly consuming the same fate? A murder-suicide was not immediately ruled out. Had one of them planned this? Had a moment of overwhelming emotion led to a tragic choice? And yet, there was no evidence to suggest that either had acted with intent. No letters, no signs of distress, no financial records hinting at hidden motives. The evening had been filled with celebration, laughter, the embrace of friends and colleagues. There was no indication that anything had been amiss. Still, there was one detail that refused to fit: the message. If this had been a murder-suicide, who had sent it? As investigators combed through security footage, the mystery deepened. The corridor outside their suite had remained still throughout the night. No one had entered. No unfamiliar figures had appeared. Except, at precisely 2:13 a.m., a shadow. A brief flicker at the far end of the hallway. A movement so quick, so subtle, that it barely registered against the static silence of the hotel's surveillance feed. Yet the room remained locked. There was no way in, no way out. Detectives turned their focus outward. Judge Kindred had spent years presiding over high-profile cases. His rulings had sent criminals to prison, had determined the fate of powerful figures. He had been respected, feared, admired. Had an old case come back to haunt him? Had someone waited, planning, ensuring that when justice came, it would leave no trace? Miss Vandergaw had her own history. As a federal prosecutor, she had built her career on precision, dismantling defenses with methodical efficiency. She had made enemies, those who had lost everything at her hands. Were they the target, or had their relationship, once hidden, now made them vulnerable to something beyond their control? A second autopsy was performed, searching for anything that had been missed. This time, a discovery. Beneath Miss Vandergaw's fingernails, microscopic traces of a foreign substance. It was not part of the paralytic compound. It was something else entirely. Fabric. A fiber so fine, so small that it had almost been overlooked, and it did not match anything in the hotel suite. It had come from somewhere else. The search expanded. The wedding guests were questioned, one by one. The hotel staff, their movements accounted for. The forensic team reconstructed the evening from the start of the reception to the final hours before the couple entered their suite. Toxicology tests were ordered. The wine glasses on the table, still standing where they had been left, were removed for analysis. A single plate of untouched food was carefully bagged, each item recorded with meticulous attention. And then, something unusual. Judge Kindred's phone remained on the bedside table. The screen, when lifted, revealed a single unread message. 2 words, stark against the glow of the screen. A message received in the early hours of the morning, but with no name, no identifying number. The phone's records were examined, but the sender had left no trace. Whoever had sent it knew how to remain invisible. The results of the initial autopsy arrived. Both victims had been exposed to a paralytic agent. The substance, rare and difficult to obtain, had been administered in a controlled dosage. It did not act immediately. It took time. The effects would have begun subtly: slowed movement, a heavy drowsiness, a gradual descent into unconsciousness. Forensic specialists turned their attention to the wine glasses. The chemical was found in both. But there was an inconsistency. One glass contained nearly 3 times the concentration of the other. Had one consumed more than the other? Or had one been meant to die while the other remained? Investigators considered the possibilities. Could this have been a double murder? A carefully calculated act designed to leave no evidence? Or was it something more complex? Had one been poisoned first, the other unknowingly consuming the same fate? A murder-suicide was not immediately ruled out. Had one of them planned this? Had a moment of overwhelming emotion led to a tragic choice? And yet there was no evidence to suggest that either had acted with intent. No letters, no signs of distress, no financial records hinting at hidden motives. The evening had been filled with celebration, laughter, the embrace of friends and colleagues. There was no indication that anything had been amiss. Still, there was one detail that refused to fit: the message. If this had been a murder-suicide, who had sent it? As investigators combed through security footage, the mystery deepened. The corridor outside their suite had remained still throughout the night. No one had entered. No unfamiliar figures had appeared, except at precisely 2:13 a.m., a shadow. A brief flicker at the far end of the hallway, a movement so quick, so subtle, that it barely registered against the static silence of the hotel's surveillance feed. Yet the room remained locked. There was no way in, no way out. Detectives turned their focus outward. Judge Kindred had spent years presiding over high-profile cases. His rulings had sent criminals to prison, had determined the fate of powerful figures. He had been respected, feared, admired. Had an old case come back to haunt him? Had someone waited, planning, ensuring that when justice came, it would leave no trace? Miss Vandergaw had her own history. As a federal prosecutor, she had built her career on precision, dismantling defenses with methodical efficiency. She had made enemies, those who had lost everything at her hands. Were they the target? Or had their relationship, once hidden, now made them vulnerable to something beyond their control? A second autopsy was performed, searching for anything that had been missed. This time, a discovery. Beneath Miss Vandergaw's fingernails, microscopic traces of a foreign substance. It was not part of the paralytic compound. It was something else entirely. Fabric. A fiber so fine, so small, that it had almost been overlooked, and it did not match anything in the hotel suite. It had come from somewhere else. The search expanded. The wedding guests were questioned, one by one. The hotel staff, their movements accounted for. The forensic team reconstructed the evening from the start of the reception to the final hours before the couple entered their suite. The words were careful, calculated. There was nothing explicit, nothing that would hold in a court of law. And yet, the subtext was unmistakable. You know what this means. We both do. Had it ended there, the affair may have remained nothing more than a rumor, a quiet scandal whispered in legal circles, never spoken aloud. But it did not end there. A case, a high-profile prosecution, one that could define Miss Vandergaw's career, a case that landed squarely in Judge Kindred's courtroom, a ruling in her favor, a judgment that tipped the balance. And suddenly, the whispers grew louder. Colleagues began to notice. The defense attorney on the case, Robert Calloway, raised an objection. His request for recusal was denied. The verdict stood, yet the questions remained. Had the law been followed, or had the lines between justice and personal ties become indistinguishable? Then, something unexpected. A witness. A clerk who had seen something, or thought they had. A conversation that should not have taken place. A meeting behind closed doors before the ruling had been made. A simple interaction, a moment too insignificant to raise alarm at the time. But now, with the trial over, it took on a new meaning. The Judiciary Ethics Board began an inquiry. Emails were requested. Phone records were examined. The investigation did not reveal direct proof of misconduct, but it uncovered something else, something even more damning. It was not the case itself that unraveled their secret. It was what came after. A financial transaction, a withdrawal from an account linked to Miss Vandergaw, a deposit into another, an account traced back to an individual who, on paper, had no connection to either of them. But beneath the surface, that individual had ties to a case that had been ruled on by Judge Kindred, a case that had been closed. Someone had been paid, not for testimony, not for evidence, for silence. The scandal had reached beyond the courtroom. It had seeped into the spaces they thought untouchable. Judge Kindred and Miss Vandergaw had not just hidden an affair. They had hidden decisions made in confidence, actions taken behind the shield of authority. And now there were those who knew. Robert Calloway had waited. He had lost the case, but he had gained something far more valuable: leverage. With every ruling, every interaction, every moment where the balance of power shifted in their favor, the risk increased. Judge Kindred had been a man of order, of control, but order cannot protect against what is unseen. The wedding should have been the closing chapter, the moment when the past faded, when the weight of secrecy lifted. Instead, it became something else: a statement, a reminder that debts do not remain unpaid, that knowledge, once acquired, cannot be forgotten. The question now was not whether the affair had led to their deaths. The question was, who had known, and who had decided that knowledge was worth killing for? The investigation had unearthed fragments of truth, small, scattered pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit. Judge Kindred and Miss Vandergaw had not simply died. Their deaths had been orchestrated, planned with an understanding of precision, of finality. Yet the greatest question remained unanswered: who had done it? The suspects were many, their motives layered beneath years of personal and professional entanglements. Each held a reason, some born from anger, others from necessity. And in this case, where silence had been carefully maintained, there were those who had the most to gain from ensuring it remained unbroken. One by one, they emerged from the shadows of the past. Had watched, had listened. A journalist, one who specialized in legal affairs, one who had built her career on exposing the hidden intricacies of the judicial system. She had followed Judge Kindred's rulings for years, had written about Miss Vandergaw's rapid ascent, and had once briefly been involved with Judge Kindred, a fact that had remained largely unknown. Had she uncovered something? Had she come across information that had made them vulnerable? Her articles had often hinted at the complexities of the justice system, at the ways in which the law, when manipulated, could be made to serve the interests of the powerful. Had she been writing about them all along? A woman whose words had influenced public perception. A woman who, perhaps, had known more than she had ever revealed. The unseen hand. And yet, the most unsettling possibility remained: that the one responsible had not been among them at all, that the deaths of Judge Kindred and Miss Vandergaw had not been personal, that they had been the result of something else entirely, something calculated, something without emotion, a debt owed to someone unknown, a decision made in a place where justice held no meaning, a truth buried beneath layers of silence, waiting to be uncovered. Who had ended their lives? Who had ensured that, when the door to their suite was opened, the only thing that remained was the stillness of death? And most importantly, who had sent the message? A question that even now had no answer. For weeks, the case had remained a labyrinth of unanswered questions. Theories had risen and fallen, suspects had been examined, their motives laid bare. Yet the truth remained elusive, hidden beneath the precision of a crime that left no trace, no clear path to justice. Until now. A single breakthrough. Not found in the crime scene, not in the carefully reconstructed timeline of the evening, but in something overlooked. A detail so small, so seemingly insignificant, that it had slipped past even the most meticulous of investigators. It was not the message on Judge Kindred's phone. It was not the surveillance footage of the corridor, the shadowed figure passing beyond the reach of clear identification. It was something else entirely. The hotel's internal system recorded not only keycard entries, but also temperature fluctuations, minute adjustments in room climate logged and stored. And within that data, buried among routine settings, a change occurred at precisely 2:09 a.m. The thermostat in Judge Kindred and Miss Vandergaw's suite had been altered. The temperature lowered. The system registered the adjustment as manual, not automated. Someone had been inside. Someone had made the change. A small, almost imperceptible action, but one that indicated presence. And yet, the door had remained locked. Investigators returned to the security logs, re-examining the hours leading up to the moment of death. The access records showed no entries, no anomalies. The only keycard used belonged to Judge Kindred. But then, an inconsistency. A name appeared where it should not have. Robert Calloway. His keycard had been logged into the system once at 11:30 p.m. when he checked out of his room. But at 2:07 a.m., 2 minutes before the temperature change, it appeared again. Not at his suite, not at the front desk, but at the service entrance, a door that, by all official records, he had never used. The footage confirmed it. A shadowed figure bundled against the cold, moving quickly, precisely. A man who had left hours earlier, a man who had no reason to return. But the evidence was still incomplete. How had he entered a locked room? And then, an answer. The mechanism on the suite's door had shown no signs of tampering, no forced entry. But beneath the handle where the latch met the frame, a forensic analysis found something unusual. A faint residue. It was oil-based, a type used in high-end locksmithing. And on the carpet near the entrance, barely visible, a mark. A pattern left by something small, something metallic. A tool. The kind designed to bypass locks, to slip quietly into place and release a door without the need for force. Robert Calloway had entered that room. He had stood in the silence of the suite, in the dim glow of the bedside lamp, and then he had left. But the method of murder remained a question. The paralytic agent found in their systems had been ingested. There were no signs of forced administration, no struggle, no external injection sites, until one final test. The fabric found beneath Ms. Vandergaw's fingernails was re-examined. The fibers traced not only to Calloway's coat, but to the inner lining of a pair of gloves, a detail that changed everything. The gloves had been designed for chemical handling, resistant to contamination. Calloway had not only entered the room, he had prepared the wine glasses. The paralytic agent had not been in the wine itself, it had been on the rim, and with the first sip the toxin had entered their systems. Slowly it had taken effect. Their limbs had grown heavy, their movements sluggish. By the time they understood, it had already been too late. Calloway had been careful. He had left nothing behind, no fingerprints, no traceable evidence. The message on Judge Kindred's phone, "It's done," had been sent after he left from a secondary device that had never been recovered. And yet, despite the overwhelming weight of the evidence, there was one final revelation. Calloway had been present. He had set the events into motion, but the second wine glass, Judge Kindred's, held a significantly lower dose. Was he meant to survive? Had the plan gone wrong? Or had there been someone else? A final possibility emerged. That Calloway had not acted alone, that another hand had been involved, one that had ensured that, when the night ended, there would be no survivors, one that remained unknown. To this day, Calloway denies his involvement. The evidence, though compelling, remains circumstantial, and the message, "It's done," was never traced to a sender. Justice, it seemed, had been written in the silence of that room, a silence that endures. The final pieces of evidence had been laid bare. The figures in this story had played their roles, some knowingly, others unwittingly. And yet, despite the weight of facts, despite the careful assembly of timelines, there is one question that refuses to be silenced. Was justice truly served? Robert Calloway, the man whose keycard placed him at the scene, the man whose fingerprints were never found, yet whose presence had been etched into the details that only time and investigation had revealed. His knowledge of the law, of its gaps and failings, had allowed him to walk the line between suspicion and certainty. But the absence of absolute proof cast a shadow over the case. His alibi was fractured, yet never fully dismantled. His presence at the hotel undeniable, yet no confession was ever extracted. His involvement heavily implied, yet never legally sealed. The trial that followed became an argument of reason against doubt. The prosecution laid out the connections, the circumstances, the improbability of coincidence. The defense in turn dismantled it, pointing to what was not there. No eyewitnesses, no clear motive, no confession, and so the verdict was delivered. Robert Calloway walked free. Some called it a failure of justice. Others saw it as the unavoidable result of a case built on the edges of certainty. But within the folds of legal proceedings, one truth remained. Judge Kindred and Ms. Vandergaw had died under circumstances that could not be ignored. And then, a revelation. Long after the trial had ended, after the courtroom had emptied, and the case had begun to settle into the archives, another message appeared. Not on a phone, not in a legal document, but in a bank record. A payment, small, almost insignificant, transferred from an unknown source to a private account, just 3 days after Calloway's acquittal, a sum that would not normally warrant attention, except for one detail. The account belonged to a former hotel employee, a night shift worker, one whose duties included maintaining the service entrance, the entrance used at 2:07 a.m., a single transaction, undocumented, unexplained, and then nothing. The account was closed, the funds withdrawn, the recipient untraceable. Had Calloway acted alone? Had he orchestrated every step, or had there been another working in the spaces beyond visibility? A final question lingers in the cold air of this case. Was justice truly blind? Or had the truth been buried beneath layers of careful precision, known only to those who had ensured it would never fully be uncovered? What do you think? Had the law served its purpose? Or was there still a missing piece waiting to be found? Tell us your thoughts. And if you seek more mysteries, cases where the answers remain just beyond reach, watch our next story, where a verdict was given, but the truth may still lie in the shadows.